start, I wanted to allow the time for either Don Zelazny or Jim Lanin to say anything, if they would like.
Hi,
Hold on.
Hi, Stephanie. This is Don Zelazny. I don't have anything to say. I echo Margot's comments. I think this is a exciting next step in our efforts to ultimately get to final restoration, full removal of the Buffalo River area of concern from the Clean Water Act. And this will be a big step, and we're very anxious to find out from the public and those people who are participating. If you have any comments today, or if not, you're always welcome to send in comments, and you'll get more information on that by the end of the session. So thanks, Stephanie.
Thank you, Don.
And Stephanie, I wanted to mention that if I do need to speak to anything today, just bear with me and give me a few seconds to respond to any questions or comments, because I'm on 2 devices and I need to refresh my screens and make sure I'm unmuting the correct device.
Okay.
That's why I didn't speak up quicker. Thanks.
Yep. And thank you, Margot, for the introduction. I will just say again that my name is Stephanie Tatarovich, and on behalf of Buffalo Niagara Waterkeeper and New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, I'd like to give a presentation today on the Buffalo River Area of Concern, restrictions on dredging activities, beneficial use impairment removal. I will turn my camera off for the duration of the presentation, and I'll turn it back on when we get to our Q&A session. So today I'm presenting the case for removal on the restrictions on dredging beneficial use impairment. This is not just a DEC effort. Many project partners and groups over the past decades have worked towards where we are today. Some of these efforts will be discussed later in this presentation. Next slide. Today's presentation will provide a very simplified overview of the restrictions on dredging activities BUI report. This report is posted on Buffalo Niagara Waterkeeper's website for 30 days from August 9th to September 8th. We want to encourage you to review the report and submit any comments, thoughts, questions to us via the survey provided in the meeting invitation, and I believe will be also shared in the chat. Today's presentation includes a brief overview of the AOC program, the remedial action process, beneficial use impairment designation and removal, and then finally some time for questions at the end. I'd also like to take this opportunity for Claudia to maybe go over some of the features on Zoom for any questions or hand raising. I don't know if we're doing that during this presentation.
Sure. Folks, if you have questions, you can just type them in the chat. That would be the best way to get your questions. And then Stephanie, if it's all right with you, we can just go through those at the end. You can also, if you have questions not on the content, but you're having a Zoom difficulty, I'm happy to try and help you, and I'll be monitoring the chat. So you can just type that in there as well.
Next slide. So this image here does have small text, but it does provide the visual for where all 43 of the Great Lakes areas of concerns are located. And these areas of concerns are the most polluted locations around the Great Lakes, identified under the U.S.-Canada Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. An AOC is a location that has experienced environmental degradation, and there are 26 of AOCs in the U.S. and 12 in Canada, and 5 binational that are managed jointly by Canada and U.S. These areas are designated as AOCs mostly due to former heavy industry and manufacturing and accompanying land use and population growth that resulted in the degradation of natural resources in these areas. Currently, 9 of the 43 have been delisted, 6 of which are in the US. Next slide. Next, we will move on to New York State. Specifically, there are 6 AOCs. Going from west to east, we have the Buffalo River, the Niagara River, the Rochester Embayment, the Oswego River, and the St. Lawrence River. The Oswego River was delisted in 2006. The figure on the right shows the AOC boundary for the Buffalo River, and it extends along the historically industrialized portion, beginning at the mouth of the river at Lake Erie and then continuing approximately 6 miles upstream to the Bailey Avenue Bridge. It also contains the City Ship Canal located adjacent to the river. A large extent of the Buffalo River and City Ship Canal within the AOC boundary is designated as a federal navigation channel maintained by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Next slide. This is an enlarged figure of the Buffalo River AOC, where the blue here is the AOC boundary, and the pink shows the boundaries of the federal navigation channel. Next slide. Under the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, beneficial use impairments are designations created by the International Joint Commission representing different types of significant environmental degradation. There are 14 potential BUIs, and of the 14 possible BUIs identified by IJC, 9 BUIs were identified for the Buffalo River AOC. There are 5 that have not been applied to Buffalo River AOC, which are restrictions on drinking water consumption, degradation of phytoplankton and zooplankton populations, eutrophication of undesirable algae, beach closings, and added cost to agriculture industry. Back in the 80s and 90s, through collaborative process, remedial action plans were developed to provide the roadmap for restoring the beneficial uses and ultimately delisting the AOC. In Buffalo, 9 BUIs were designated as impaired and 2 have been removed. The degradation of aesthetics and the tainting of fish and wildlife flavor. I'd like to point out that BUIs are different than water quality impairments defined under Section 303D of the Clean Water Act, and in most cases, BUI removal is not directly related to or contingent on the 303D status of the AOC water body. Next slide. So in 1987, a group of citizen scientists and stakeholders, along with DEC, formed the Buffalo River Remedial Advisory Committee, or the RAC, to identify and address BUIs within the AOC. The graphic shown is the 6-step process taken to remove a BUI, and each AOC has site-specific BUIs, which not all 14 may be impaired. As mentioned previously, Buffalo River has 9 out of the 14 BUIs identified. Next is to determine the causes of the BUI and identifying sources for cause of impairment. Once a problem is identified, a solution can be applied where goals and/or criteria is developed for cleanup and restoration. Next is to mitigate, assess, and monitor to ensure goals or criteria are met. Then the BUI can be removed, and when all BUIs in an AOC are removed, the AOC can be delisted. Next slide. Steps on the previous slide are carried out through the implementation of remedial action plans. The Stage 1 and Stage 2 remedial action plan for the Buffalo River AOC was published in 1987. BUIs and the causes and the root problems of them were identified. And for the Buffalo River, it was that multiple contaminants that were at concentrations exceeding criteria for open lake disposal for the restrictions on dredging BUI. This means that dredge sediments were not able to be placed in Lake Erie due to the high contaminant concentrations. Open lake disposal criteria came from the Clean Water Act, Section 404B1, guidelines regarding open water placement and dredge sediment. Under the Clean Water Act, U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, or U.S. EPA, and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers have primary authority over regulation of dredge and fill material into navigable waters. The open water placement criteria is a measure used and enforced to prevent introducing contamination into a clean or lesser contaminated area. Proposed actions to restore BUIs included assessing the extent of sediment contamination and addressing upland sources, which were inactive hazardous waste sites located along the banks of the river.
Hey, Stephanie.
Yes.
I'm so sorry to interrupt. We're having just a little trouble with your audio. I wonder if you might try headphones if you have them. Another thing that might help us, it's just sounding a little choppy on our end. Another thing that might help is if you have anything else open in the background, it might be your Wi-Fi. Just wanted to ask if you might have headphones or be able to try that.
Let me try closing out items.
Okay.
So we'll just take 5 minutes here, see if we can get the audio a little bit clearer, and then we'll pick this back up so everyone gets a couple minute break.
Are you able to hear me now? Better?
Yeah, that's much better. Does that sound better to you, Margot?
It does. It sounds much clearer.
Thank you,
Okay.
Stephanie.
Well, I'm glad I was able to scrounge up a pair of headphones. Should we continue moving forward with the presentation?
Yes. Are you next slide, or do you have some more points on this slide?
I just wanted to note that the causes for impairment that were identified, these were identified at the time of the remedial action plan publication, and as normally happens, actions can be modified over time as new information becomes available, and there was an addendum to the RAP published in 2011. Next slide. So the original identified causes were exceeding contamination for the following contaminants of concern: arsenic, barium, copper, iron, lead, manganese, zinc, and cyanide. The sources of contamination included upland inactive hazardous waste sites, originally due to the industrialized banks of the river in the 1900s. Later on, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, or PAHs, and polychlorinated biphenyls, PCBs, and mercury were later added, which I will get into. Next slide. Oh, sorry, I was looking down at, okay. In 2021, the Buffalo River RAC formed a dredging subcommittee to review the existing removal criteria and develop modifications to ensure that the criteria was logical, specific to the AOC, and achievable. The original criteria had some vague terminology that was subject to interpretation and presented scenarios that were beyond the scope of the AOC program. The full RAC approved the proposed changes of the new criteria in December of 2021, and the final criteria reads: sediment dredged from the Federal Navigation Channel does not require special dredged material management measures or the use of an Army Corps confined disposal facility due to chemical contamination. With the footnote that, as always has been the case, dredging activities outside of the Federal Navigation Channel will be required to follow the current or future permitting processes of the mentioned agencies and meet the associated standards. Next slide. The attainment of targets or criteria is ideal, but there are 4 BUI removal scenarios that exist. Option A is to remove targets criteria. Removal targets and criteria are met and the beneficial use has been restored. B, impairment is not limited to the AOC, but rather is typical of lake-wide, region-wide, or area-wide conditions. C, impairment is caused by sources outside of the AOC. And D, impairment is due to natural rather than human causes. Option A is the best path to BUI removal, but in cases where this is not possible or feasible, a BUI can be removed under the other scenarios or a combination of them. Next slide. Here's the graphic that was shown earlier, and there are 3 components to step 4, which provides the basis for removal and is the focus of today's presentation. The first was to address upland sources and remove contaminated river sediments. This was done through state Superfund programs and the Great Lakes Legacy Act and the Army Corps of Engineers. Next was to assess bottom sediments to see if any remaining contamination existed. This was done through year 2 and year 5 verification monitoring conducted post-remedial dredging, which I'll get to in a moment. And lastly is to monitor sediments to ensure remedial goals are met, which was also done in part through year 2 and year 5 monitoring. Next slide. I'd like to go over a brief timeline of remedial activities. Additional details are in the BUI removal report, which also includes full study reports as appendices. The Great Lakes Legacy Act was passed by Congress in 2002. This funding accelerated cleanup of contaminated sediment within all Great Lakes areas of concerns. The Great Lakes Legacy Act activities for Buffalo River were led by the Buffalo River Restoration Partnership, which was formed in 2007 and led the coordination and planning of efforts to address the contaminated bottom sediments within the AOC. This group consisted of US EPA, New York State DEC, Buffalo Niagara Waterkeeper, Army Corps of Engineers, the City of Buffalo, and Honeywell. In 2011, the feasibility study was completed to determine the best alternative to remove contaminated sediments. The Army Corps conducted a backlog of federal navigational channel dredging at the same time, but this was not done under the Great Lakes Legacy Act. In 2013, remedial design was completed and the dredging in areas outside of the federal navigational channel were initiated. And then in 2014, the tip of the City Ship Canal was capped to contain the remaining contaminated sediments. So although the removal criteria is limited to the federal navigation channel, it was necessary to dredge in areas outside of the navigation channel so that contaminants are not reintroduced. Next slide. Here's a cross-section of the Buffalo River that shows, how once the navigation channel is dredged, how contamination from the side slopes could be reintroduced by falling into the channel. Therefore, that is why the environmental dredging was conducted so that recontamination would not occur. Next slide. This is another figure that shows the Great Lakes Legacy Act activities. You can see the yellow in the City Ship Canal, that was the cap put in place. The blue areas shown are the areas that were dredged. The green areas are some habitat restoration areas, and there is some spots that were backfilled to help with slope stability and cap contaminated areas. Next slide. As part of the Great Lakes Legacy Act project, verification monitoring was performed at year 2 and year 5 following completion of the remedial dredging activities to evaluate environmental conditions and determine if remedial goals of the project were achieved. The 4 contaminants listed, lead, mercury, PCBs, and PAHs, were used as indicator chemicals determined by multiple lines of evidence in the feasibility study. by addressing risks associated with the indicator chemicals, the feasibility study remedy would address the risks posed by all of the contaminants of concern because these 4 have the highest ecological risk. In 2017, year 2 results show that the majority of PAH samples met remedial goals. About 20% exceeded the remedial goals, and slightly under half of the samples met remedial goals for metals and PCBs. And then in 2020, year 5 results show that 94% of PAH samples met remedial goals. Metals and PCBs had 11 out of 17 samples that met remedial goals. The remaining sites included areas that couldn't be dredged due to obstructions such as utility lines and bridges. So overall, 26 out of the original 33 samples met goals. We also have bathymetry data that shows natural recovery is an ongoing process in the Buffalo River AOC that indicates contamination will continue to decrease. DMUs are dredge management units and were defined in earlier sediment studies to better manage sediment remediation during dredging activities from 2011 to 2013. DMUs 16 and 17 were found to be highly elevated in PAHs, therefore required additional remediation. Some challenges at this site was the slope and stability of the bank, and so it was unable to be completely dredged out. And so the remedy ended up being that the navigation channel would be dredged and a cover would be placed over areas outside of the nav channel. Next slide. Here is a figure that shows all of the DMUs, and you can see DMU 16 and 17 is left of the Buffalo Color Peninsula, if you're familiar with the area. I don't know if we can indicate it, but next slide. Around the same time, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers conducted sampling in 2018. They conducted sediment sampling to analyze suitability for open water placement in Lake Erie and to determine the status of the restrictions on dredging activities BUI. Only 5 sample sites out of the 30 within the Buffalo River Channel required further evaluation, exceeding at least one of the COCs for the sites. And then in 2020, all the sample locations were found to meet the criteria using the operation and maintenance sampling after the dredging that was conducted in 2020. The operation and maintenance sampling, I would like to note that it wasn't done in support of the BUI, but the timing was good to ensure that the sediments no longer were contaminated, rather than going on the assumption that the 2020 dredging removed it all, as we only had the 2018 data at the time to look at. Next slide. So in 2015, the upper portion of the Buffalo River was analyzed for beneficial reuse for an Army Corps wetland project at Unity Island as part of the Niagara River AOC restoration work. They were found to be clean and they were then used in 2018. And then also in 2018, the Army Corps conducted an aquatic beneficial reuse analysis of the Buffalo River sediments. The beneficial reuse criteria came from the Clean Water Act, and this was the same analysis I mentioned on the previous slide, that the aquatic beneficial reuse criteria is the same as the open water placement criteria. And so it was found to meet the guidelines for open water placement criteria and approved for aquatic beneficial reuse. In 2022, the Army Corps conducted upland beneficial reuse of the sediments. The same data was used in 2018, was used for this analysis because the operation and maintenance sampling came after. The dredged material is compared against the criteria listed in Table 1 through 4 of the New York State DEC regulations for residential and groundwater soil cleanup objectives. There was one composite sample that exceeded mainly metals in one area, but because this was using the 2018 data, we know that this no longer is true because this area was dredged in 2020. So all samples met the soil cleanup criteria, and therefore the criteria for upland beneficial reuse is met. Next slide. In summary, through the Buffalo River Restoration Partnership group and the Army Corps of Engineers, contaminated sediments have been dredged, and sediments now meet the project remedial goals. They have also been tested for beneficial reuse, both aquatic and upland. Dredge material has met criteria for aquatic placement, which is the same criteria for open water placement as I mentioned, and dredge material is no longer impaired for disposal or reuse. Therefore, the BUI removal criteria has been met and the BUI can be removed. Next slide. So next steps, the BUI removal report will be posted on Buffalo Niagara Waterkeeper's website. And after the 30 days, we will submit the final report with comments received from the public and seek concurrence from EPA. And we are still striving to have the BUI removal in September. I would like to remind you that the report link is in the chat. It's also available in the press release, and I strongly recommend you to read the report and provide input and any personal experiences or thoughts regarding the Buffalo River AOC. Next slide. I would like to acknowledge that beyond DEC, there have been many partner organizations who have contributed to the restoration of the Buffalo River area of concern. I'm sure there are others not on here, but thank you to everyone. Next slide. And thank you for joining this presentation. I hope that you will read the report, provide your input to us. I look forward to reviewing it. And now we can move on to the Q&A session. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie. So, Claudia, let us know if any questions came in the chat. And if there were no questions in the chat, but you just have a question, feel free at this time to unmute yourself, turn your camera on if you like, and we can just have a conversation.
No questions in the chat so far, but yeah, I definitely encourage everyone to ask your questions now. You can type them in the chat or, yep, unmute yourself, and it'd be great to talk through it.
I imagine it's in the report, but what are the criteria for, you know, disposing of the dredge material in open water, and what were the measurements? Like, were they significantly lower than the criteria, or kind of just below it?
So over time, Army Corps has modified the way that they determine, you know, the open water placement of dredge materials, but it used to have definitive numbers, but at this time it's more of a comprehensive analysis that takes in multiple factors. And so there is no clear cut, you met this number, you can, you know, dispose of it, but it goes through the Army Corps analysis. So that is kind of described in the report, but I can also follow up with you with additional information.
And Emily, I just want to throw in there too that the criteria is not based on removal if the sediment is suitable for open lake, because we don't have open lake placement in the eastern basin of Lake Erie. It's instead based upon not having to go into the CDF due to chemical contamination. So we did some of our comparative analysis with the DEC's upland requirements. That's that 2020 analysis that Stephanie was mentioning that the Army Corps did. So the open lake is part of it, but it's not a one-to-one comparison, if that makes sense.
Okay, thank you.
Stephanie, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
So somewhat related to Emily's comment, what I think there was a lot of work has been completed, the remediation, the subsequent monitoring and assessments of the contaminant levels. And you mentioned some numbers about something like 16 of 21 samples, the contaminant concentrations were below remediation goals. And because there's so much and so much information was presented, it gets a little bit difficult to fully assess what might remain in the sediment. And I was wondering if, after everything, the final assessments and monitoring had been completed, whether that was the 5-year post Legacy Act remedial work, or if it was through the Army Corps' ongoing maintenance dredging, the monitoring that goes along with that. But are there areas that we know still contain contaminant levels which exceed criteria, the remediation goals, I guess, and are those areas, if there are those areas within the Federal Navigation Channel, which is really I think within the scope of this BUI, and the areas outside the channel are maybe not directly tied to the BUI itself, but could impact the navigational section should any of that material move in. So I guess just a high level summary of what might still remain out there, and is there future monitoring, or how will we continue? You mentioned the incoming sediments, and over time the natural attenuation with the cleaner sediments covering any contaminants that might remain. But are there plans in place to monitor that in some way?
Yeah, so there are one or two. I can give an example. There is, one location in the City Ship Canal where, due to utility lines, that area cannot be dredged by the Army Corps. And as I said, and you said, that there were bathymetry surveys conducted during the verification monitoring that show that areas such as that one do have sediment accumulation over time. So it will naturally kind of cover that elevated area. And each area that, was known of was evaluated for this, and found that in general, Buffalo River tends to have a sediment accumulating. So therefore, there is no additional remediation action work determined by the project coordination team due to that information.
And will those areas be monitored in any way, though, the contaminant levels in the future? Or don't we know at this point?
Not at this time, and not by the project coordination team.
Okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Stephanie, a follow-up question related to that. So you said it was kind of the shipyard area was where you said that there was a site that still had the exceedance.
Mm-hmm.
What was the site?
City Ship Canal.
City Ship Canal. Okay. And then, so because sediment is accumulating in the Buffalo River, is it going to kind of cover up any contaminated sediment and keep it from moving through the river? Or is the idea that it's continuing to bring in contaminated sediment that's sort of coming from outside of the AOC?
No, so clean sediment comes into the AOC from upstream from Buffalo Creek and adjacent creeks that all merge into Buffalo Creek. But so because it's all clean, we know that whatever's coming in, it's going to cover it over time, and that even the year 2, year 5 monitoring has showed that areas that were elevated at year 2 have the concentrations have lowered in year 5. So we see that in action with the majority of sites, and and then they were dredged, but we saw that pattern happening. So there's no contaminated sediments that are continuing to come in. All sources have been mitigated. Therefore, and also I'd like to note that some of the capped areas or the areas that had cover placed on them as part of the remedial work, those will continue to be monitored either through City of Buffalo or DEC, Division of Remediation. So there is some monitoring for some of the areas, but it's specific to each site. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Stephanie, I just saw a question pop up in the chat from George, and he asks, what is a cover plate?
I believe I said cover placed. Sorry for my enunciation, but a cover is where sediment is placed on top of a contaminated area. There is kind of a difference in definition of a cap versus cover, so I use cover in this instance. But essentially, it immobilizes and keeps contaminated sediments from moving outside of that area. It's not clay. They're just clean sediments. Even, for example, in the DMU 16 and 17, it was a clean layer of sand, and it was a foot thick, and so the first 6 inches was actually granulated activated carbon mixed in with the sand placed on top, and then on top of that is 6 inches of clean sand. And those areas are monitored, and the sand doesn't move. So
Anyone else have any other questions? They don't have to be wildly complex and technical, as most of them are that we have gotten. Stephanie, can you talk to us a little bit more about the CDF, since the criteria is based on the confined disposal facility, because the sediment historically had been highly contaminated, and even though right now it's not as contaminated, we may still put it in the disposal facility. Do you want to just talk a little bit about the mechanics of what happens with Buffalo River sediment?
sure. So as Margot had mentioned in the past, sediments that were dredged were put in the Army Corps confined disposal facility, which is basically in the Buffalo Harbor, an area where in which contaminated sediments are stored, so that they are not, released into Lake Erie or whatnot. And so that's where we've been putting dredged sediments, aside from, the Unity Island project for, some of those clean sediments located on upstream, in the upstream area of the AOC. And so now through all this testing with the U.S. Army Corps, the 2018 and the 2020 data, we know that the sediments are not contaminated and therefore do not need to be put into the CDF. But they, at least for, this, in these last, few years, they have been placed in the CDF because it is the most cost-effective option, because Margot had mentioned earlier, we do not have an open lake placement area designated yet. I think Army Corps is still in that process of determining a suitable area. So we are continuing to put sediments into the CDF, just as I said, most efficient and cost-effective option. But we do have a plan in 2023, 2024, when we're going to have another cycle of routine dredging. Those sediments are going to be used for a beneficial reuse project in Buffalo Harbor, the SLIP 3 project. It's going to be a habitat area. And so sediments from the Buffalo River are going to be used to kind of fill up some areas to create that wetland area. And moving forward, we hope that there will be more beneficial reuse projects to use the sediments for. I don't have much else to add aside from that.
We have another CDF question that you may or may not be able to answer with a lot of specificity, but it's about if the CDF is protected from weather.
It is open. It's kind of like a little bowl, you could say, where there's like a little wall. Well, it's not little, but it's a wall that prevents the sediments from going out. But if there's rain or whatnot, the water, I believe, is able to travel through that. It's like just a rock wall, and so it just is a way to ensure that the contaminants aren't released.
Thank you. That's helpful. Yeah, George, the confined disposal facilities are a Great Lakes creation, and they're all over the Great Lakes as a way to contain sediment from many of the lakes were often used as shipping channels. So they're dredged to a certain depth to accommodate commercial ship traffic. And so the CDFs were created as a way to contain this legacy contaminated sediment. And so they are built to withstand any of the effects that the lakes could throw at them. Whatever the weather is going to be, that's their intent, is to withstand that. Stephanie, there's one more in the chat from Brianne. And what is the visual difference will the public see due to these projects? And so that's a pretty broad question, but if you want to apply it to dredging specifically, or the whole AOC, I think there's another suite of answers based on the other BUIs.
Yeah, there is. I was going to give a very broad answer. But I mean, so with the cleanup of contaminated sediments, now we see through other sampling we've been doing that we see more fish in the water, more variety of fish, healthier fish. There's, after the cleanup of sediments, there has also been, habitat restoration along the banks. And so I think you can see a lot more physical improvement, the public through these habitat projects, more public access projects, which the Buffalo Niagara Waterkeeper can speak a lot more to, as they have taken the lead on implementing these projects. But with the clean soil, it was the base to everything else building upon it.
So George also says, I thought some shoreline planting and shoreline cleanup was done as part of this project. So to pick up on Stephanie's answer, the sediment was the baseline. We needed to get cleaner sediment into the river in order for, like Stephanie said, healthier fish, healthier habitat opportunities. And so, George, there are 14 potential beneficial use impairments that any area of concern can have. I think the Buffalo River was plagued with 9 or 10 of them. And so today we are just talking about the progress metrics we've made with regard to the restrictions on dredging beneficial use impairment, but the Buffalo River area of concern restoration as a whole had this huge dredging component, and then it also had about 14 habitat restoration sites that were a mix of upland restoration. For example, the New York State DEC boat launch that's at Ohio Street, that was one of the projects that was renovated, or that was first restored under this funding, and then it was got an even greater enhancement through some subsequent funding more recently. But there was also shoreline plantings that were included, and some of the shoreline plantings were part of the Legacy Act project. So once the initial dredging happened, the Honeywell and the US EPA and the Army Corps went in and did some plantings right along the shoreline. So that's also part of this project as a whole. Our conversation today is just sort of strictly focused on dredging. Did that help? Do you have a more specific question? Anything else anyone wants to talk about?
Margot, I'm just going to add on that, the related to the last point. So for those of you that might be interested, there are, as Margot mentioned, there are several BUIs that were designated for the Buffalo River area of concern. Still quite a few remaining. I think this is the third or fourth one that's been removed so far. Not sure. But there's
the third.
The third. So there's 2 more in the works. Hopefully by the end of 2022 calendar year. The loss of fish and wildlife habitat and potentially the degradation of benthos, which I'm not really going to mention, but the loss of fish and wildlife habitat, we're hoping will be the next one. And we have a draft report in progress for that. And ultimately, when we get to the point where we're ready to present the case to the public, there will be much more information, I think, in that, along with some probably good visuals on the habitat restoration work that's been done. So the sediment removal and remediation was key to being able to restore the habitat, and the upland site remediation as well that Stephanie mentioned, the hazardous waste sites along the river. You know, that happened, that had to occur first. Since that time, there's been a lot of effort and funding going into the habitat restoration, and that will be covered much more during the public event and in the report for the Fish and Wildlife Habitat BUI.
Jim, I'll just interject really quickly to add on to what you said. I see there's a lot of agency people or who might have an organizational affiliation with us today, but there's also some folks that I think are just members of the public. So I did want to mention, if you're listening into this meeting and you're thinking, how can I help? There's many different ways for you to get involved in this work. It doesn't happen in a vacuum. We need the public, we need community, we need everyone to help us make this happen. As we get closer to delisting the Buffalo River AOC after 30 years of work. So definitely you can comment on the report that we discussed today. That is out and up on our website. Margot put that in the chat. You can join us for the next public meeting and public comment session that we're going to be having for that habitat report that Jim discussed. You can also volunteer. Buffalo Niagara Waterkeeper has lots of different volunteer opportunities, especially picking up litter and helping us keep the shorelines aesthetically pleasing along the Buffalo River. So you can help us with that. And then we'll have lots of other exciting volunteer opportunities and other ways to get involved. So I'd love, if you're interested in getting involved, please put your email in the chat, or you can send me a message directly. I'll pop my email in there as well. I'd love to help you find a space where if you want to get involved, you can. So just wanted to add that in.
Claudia, I already put your email in the chat because, you know, but also the Buffalo River Remedial Advisory Committee is public. Anyone is welcome to join the listserv and attend those meetings. So if you want to join our next RAC meeting, it's going to be in a couple weeks in September. Those are open to the public. You are more than welcome to join the conversation, stay informed, and even join a subcommittee to help draft some of these reports. They're all open to the public and led by the scientific experts, but we appreciate everyone's opinions.
Yeah, and we did just have a really great comment from Mike Gates. He said, lots of great work has been done to this historically significant Buffalo Creek territory and is long in the coming. The continued monitoring is, of course, a vital aspect of the project. So thank you, Mike, and acknowledging our partners in the Seneca Nation.
Okay, so with that, I think we're free to end our meeting. You're all free to go. We so appreciate you spending your lunch hour with us. Jim, I see you popped one more note in the chat. If you want to give a shout out to the...
I was just going to say, so the restoration efforts under the Area of Concern program are just one of many components of efforts under the 10 annexes of the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. And later in September in Niagara Falls, Ontario, it's every 3 years, EPA and Environment and Climate Change Canada and the International Joint Commission, which oversees the water quality agreement efforts ultimately. Every 3 years, they have a public forum where they report on progress. They seek input from the public. The event is free. I think registration is required. It sounds like there will be in-person and virtual options. So, we encourage everybody to, as they're interested and able to participate, please do so. We do like to have the public speak directly to the representatives from the federal agencies and the IJC to express your opinions on how the Great Lakes are doing and what we can do to further the restoration. So we encourage everybody to at least take a look, see if you're interested, and just wanted to mention it and spread the word to others who may also have an interest. That's it. Thank you, Margot, and thanks, Stephanie. Great job on the presentation.
Yeah, thank you, Stephanie. That was really informative and wonderful. So with that, email us if you want to join anything, come to the public forum, and I hope everyone has a nice day.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you all
Thanks.
for listening.